podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Travis McGrath. I'm part of the Exago services team. I'm going to be leading today's Exago support lab. This month, for our technical topic, we're going to be talking about the Batch REST API, a new feature in version 18.1, so a recently released feature that we're pretty excited about. As a few people continue to sign in, I want to make sure everyone can see my screen and hear me okay. So if you could, in the lower right-hand panel, just type a Y, yes, hello, funny story about your weekend, whatever there, just to make sure I can be heard. Okay, got a couple of them. Thanks for joining us. Today's lab is going to be pretty quick. The Batch REST API is an enhancement to an existing feature. One that we actually already covered with our .NET and Web Service API webinar a couple months back. Of course, all of our webinars are recorded, so you can go back and review this one, as well as any other support lab that we give from our knowledge base. So with that, I just want to say this lab will have a little bit of a technical component. We're going to be using some JSON and the smallest bit of C# at the end to showcase how the REST API works with Batch. So we will go through that. You don't need to know it in detail, but it helps if you know how JSON works. All right, so the first thing to do here is look at our agenda. I said this would be a pretty quick lab, so our agenda is pretty simple. We're going to go through and look at the definition, what is the Batch API, the benefits of using it, and then we're going to build some sample code on the fly there. So what is Batch API? The Batch component to our REST API is a way to use the Exago REST API, and specifically the web service. So Exago can be launched through our APIs, either from the .NET API or through our web service API, which is a REST-based web service. Previous to version 18.1, when you're using the REST API, you would have to send a post call to start a session, and then you would send other web service calls to make modifications to that session, for example, to track who the user is, what permissions they should have, and things of that nature. But with the Batch REST API, you can change the way you use the REST API and just make one single call and get many changes to the session. So in a single call, we can now start and modify a session at the same time. So what are the benefits of using it? The first one is that it's faster. Fewer web service calls and not having to wait and then recreate the session. It's going to be a faster launch of Exago if you're using the web service API. And then the second one here is that it provides a lighter network load. Because you're not making as many calls across the network to launch Exago, it's going to be a lighter load, it's going to be more performant. So that's really what this is about, is having the fastest launch of Exago you can to make it as seamless for your end user. All right, and really that's it. With that, what I want to do is jump into the code and show you how we can build this. So what I'm going to do is open up ARC is what it's called, the Advanced REST Client. This is a Google tool that lets us build REST calls here, from our desktop. So we don't have to build an entire project and compile it and run it. We're just going to build it out here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to borrow some components I've already written. So with any web service call, you need a URL. That's going to be the first thing here. And so I'm going to put in our URL to my web service API. I'm using a test build of our release coming out later this fall, but here, you can use whatever version of Exago you're looking for. And particularly with Batch, we're going to be working in 18.1 and above. The next one is our method type. If you're unfamiliar with REST-based web services, different method types are sort of like saying what the web service call is supposed to do. So a post is going to create things, a get is going to retrieve information, a delete obviously is going to delete things, a patch is going to modify things. Right now we're just going to focus on post and patch calls. And for the batch REST API, we actually only need to make a post call here. So we have our URL, we know, where the application is, and we know what type of call, but we need a little more content here. So with the web service call, you need the URL to the application, but you also need what we call a REST endpoint. These, of course, are well documented on our support site, but in this case, it's going to be very easy. We're going to say REST/batch. So we're going to say, instead of normally with a 17.2 or 3 or one of our previous versions of Exago, we would have said something like REST/session to start a session. But here, we're going to make a post call to this batch endpoint. The other thing you can do in the URL is you can add a parameter. In this case, I want to use a different config file that's been created by my admin console. So I'm going to add a parameter to my web service to let it know, hey, I want to use this config file instead of Exago's default config file. So that's our request URL. In a web service call, you also need to add a couple of headers. So the first one here I'm going to add is authorization. This tells the web service how Exago is going to authorize the web service call, how it's going to know that it's authentic. And in this case, we're going to use something called basic authentication. This is a really simple way of authenticating, but of course, when we use web service in production, we'll use an encrypted key. It'll be a little more complex, but we're essentially saying basic, and then we're giving it a string that represents a password I've set up ahead of time. To that, we're going to add a couple of other things. So we're going to say what the web service accepts, and this is going to accept JSON. And we're going to say what the content type is. And again, this is going to be application/JSON. So nothing too fancy there, just letting it know, hey, we're going to pass you JSON, and that's what we're going to accept back. And the content type is going to be JSON as well. Great. So at this point, our web service method is defined and ready to go. We know where we're going, what the endpoint is, and this is the difference for the new 18.1 batch feature. We know what type of method, we've got it authorized and ready to go. So in the body of our web service call, we need to pass some information. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to make a JSON array of other web service calls that we want to make in the order we would want to make them. So a JSON array is always going to be inside of square brackets. So everything we're going to put here is inside of square brackets. And we need to start out by building a session. To avoid the risk of typos, I'm actually going to copy the call that we need and just paste it in here. But what we're going to do here is make an array, and inside that array, so these square brackets, we're going to have a bunch of objects. In JSON, of course, each object is going to be inside its own curly brackets. And each of these, what I'm going to call batch objects, have 3 properties, up to 3 properties. The first one is the URL. The second one is the method. And then there's a third one called a payload. We don't need to worry about that just yet. I'll show you that in just a minute with our next call. The URL is going to correspond to the REST endpoint that we would call if we weren't using the batch feature. So here, instead of calling batch, previously we used to call sessions. So again, we're going to put sessions here. And then the method, this is going to say that we want to start a new session. So we're going to make a post call. At this point, if we wanted to, we could send off this web service request to Exago, and it would create a new session. But the whole benefit of using batch is that we can make a bunch of calls at once. So before we send this over, we can actually add, so I'm going to add a comma here, we can add some other batch objects to make changes to that session that we're starting with this first call. The first classic change I recommend making is we can add a parameter, or we can modify the value of a parameter for this session. So again, inside of curly braces, we're making a new batch object. We're specifying the URL as parameters/user ID. this is going to change the parameter that we've already defined in our admin console. It's going to set its value. So this is saying to go change that parameter. The method type is saying to patch. So instead of creating a new parameter, we're patching one we know already exists. And then in payload, here's where we can set things like whether or not we want to change properties of a given object. So here, the value of this parameter, we want to change it to something totally new. So we could change it to this, or I could just make it my name, whatever in our system makes sense to identify our user. And then we can do the same thing again here for company ID so that I know, I came from Exago, right? And the neat part here is we're building up a list of web service calls, but we're only actually going to make a single call. We're going to pass this information to Exago, and then without using the network, it's going to execute these in order. So it's going to create a session, patch the user ID parameter to have a new value, and then patch the company ID parameter to have a new value as well. Okay. Because these parameters are hidden and behind the scenes, when we launch Exago, you guys won't see very much different because it will be, just look like I launched a session. So we're going to make one more web service call here in order to make some changes that will actually impact the look and feel of Exago so that you'll know that there was some difference made here. So we're going to make another web service call, another batch call here. And in this batch object, we're going to add the URL, and we're going to go to settings. This is an object in the web service API that lets you change the general settings from the administration console. In this case, again, we're changing them, so we're using a patch type method. And we're changing to general, so in the payload, there's an object called general, and again, it's an array. And we're changing two specific settings. One, I'm going to switch the language file over to Spanish. So here I'm specifying a new set of language files that should be loaded when we show Exago's UI. And feeling a little nostalgic for the fall, we're going to change the CSS theme to a custom theme that we made during a support lab back in October. We called Halloween Adventures. So this is going to change the UI of Exago from its normal blue English UI to all the CSS and icons will be orange. It'll have some fun custom content, and of course the UI will be in Spanish. We could keep going. We could add as many of these batch objects as we want, patching parameters, changing data sources or other settings. We could even create and define a role to specify user permissions, similar to how we showed during our role support lab in the past. But for the sake of simplicity, these 4 calls should be good. So we're going to start a session, patch the value of 2 parameters, and then change some general settings so that the UI of Exago will look a little different. And of course, then we close our array with a closing square bracket. At this point, I'm happy with our code sample. So we can hit send, and this will send this web service call to the location with these changes. You'll see the web service call there is running on my local. And if I scroll down, I see that it's green, everything was successful. And I get a return code for each of those various calls. So return code 201 means call was successful. So here's my post to create a session. And this gives me some response content. This is just like you would see in the traditional web service API, the REST API. What I can do here is I'm going to copy this app URL, and we can use this as a one-time use code to launch Exago. Looking through it, there are some other things in here that I can use, and I can see how my other calls did. So changing the parameters and the general content, those all seem to go fine. Response code 201 means all clear here, and they didn't have any content, but that's okay. We weren't expecting anything back from those patches. Great. So with that, I can go to, I've navigated here to my direct installation of Exago's homepage. Of course, you don't see this embedded in an application. We're just going here directly for the sake of simplicity. But I can paste the app URL I got back from my web service call. So you see it's whatever homepage of Exago we want to go to, plus this encrypted string. And when I hit enter, it'll go there, and you'll notice that it's now launched Exago. A lot of the content here is in Spanish. So as we go through, so we can see that our changes took effect for this specific session. So as I navigate, it now knows who the user is. It switched over the UI and language. So these are things I expected to have happen based on the web service calls. So I want to pause here. That's really the meat of the batch REST API. It lets you make a bunch of API calls in a single web service method, and that improves performance and opens up resources on your network. So it should be much easier to use. I want to pause and see if there are any questions there. Great. I don't see any questions there. So what I'm going to do is just a little bit of technical walkthrough here. So in a more realistic example, I'm going to open up Visual Studio here. I'm going to open it up so it's nice and large. Right, so it's nice and large and we can see it. So this is going to be a more typical example of how you might see a batch REST setup implemented. And what we've done is we've defined what we call batch objects. So we've defined a custom class in a little utility here. And of course, it's a JSON, a class that we've made with JSON in mind. So we've given each each property in the class a JSON property name. But the class is very simple. It's just a URL, a method, and a payload, just like we saw in Arc with our first example. And what our code will do is, as it goes through setting the permissions of Exago, it will create a list of batch calls that will then be turned into an array and sent in a single web service call. So here we're making a list. And of course, we're starting by posting a session, just like we did in our example. So we're building a new batch object. We're saying go to the session URL and do a post and add that to our list of calls. Then, just like our example, we're going to take our user ID and our company ID that we have from the logged in user. We're going to make a batch object for each of those, where we're going to parameters / user ID, or company ID, make a patch, and then create a new JSON object where the value is equal to the value we want to set here. Then we can make a role. This is a little different from what we did in our first example. So we can make a callback to our database to get the specific Exago permissions for the user. And being an embedded application, of course, you already have those in your system, however it makes sense. So I won't go into this method because it'll vary based on your environment. But we can make another batch object to the web service endpoint roles. We're going to create a new role and give it an ID to match the user's ID. So this user's specific role. And then with that role, we can patch it. So we can make changes. So in this case, we're going to say roles / the ID of that role. So what we just defined up above, and entities. And we're going to tell it to change the role so that based on the user's permissions, you're including all data objects. If you don't want to include all data objects for a user, maybe they're not an administrator, there's certain objects that they shouldn't have access to. Instead, we can build a loop here, and we can make a list of the data objects that they do have access to, and if they need to, any row level filters. So we're looping through those objects that we've retrieved from our database. And what we can do is we can add those to a collection here as batch objects. So we can make as many calls as we want. So we're just taking this loop and adding each of those here. And we're adding the data object rows. These are the row level filters we showed in our roles support lab previously. So these batch objects are going to go into our list. And then finally, we can make a single web service. So we have a helper method called call API. And again, we're making a post call. We're going to the batch endpoint. And then we're sending it one JSON object with all of the other calls that we wanted to make. And with that, we can launch Exago. So this is going to be a more realistic sort of example. It's a little more complex because we want to do more sophisticated things, maybe by building roles. But the same concept applies. We're making a single web service call to our batch endpoint and passing in a JSON array of other batch calls, if you will. Great. So with that, I just want to pause and again see if there are any questions at all. Okay, well, as some questions come in, let me just say for next month's lab, let me give you a quick briefing here. We're gonna, of course, like always, have a end user and a support lab, technical lab. And the end user lab is gonna be August 8th. We're gonna take a report that we found and liked and found interesting in a couple of ways, and we're gonna show start to finish how to build it. So it's gonna take a lot of the concepts the end user support labs have been covering so far and put them all together into a single start to finish report. And then on the 22nd, we're going to do a use case for a custom function. So we're going to show you an example of a custom function of building a year-to-date check and how that can be used in a couple of interesting ways. And after this lab, of course, as you sign out, you'll be prompted to do a quick survey just to give us some feedback. In that, we're looking for folks to suggest new end-user topics. We're interested in which parts of the Exago UI you want to hear about, what features you want more details on. So please make sure to just give a moment's thought and add a few suggestions there. Most of our support labs come from user feedback and suggestion, so we're really excited to hear your thoughts there. So with that, it doesn't look like any questions came in, so I hope you found this lab helpful, and I'll close it there and just say happy recording.